How's everyone doing? Good, good, good. So I feel like this place is sort of cool. I feel I'm just a little bit cooler today because I'm here. So a little hip and holy. So Children at Risk is the organization I'm a part of. We're all over the state of Texas, and one of the best ways to talk about Children at Risk and what we do is I visit with a lot of parents all over the state. And some of you are parents. Some of you have been children in your lives. You understand some of these things. But one of the things that I see with first-time parents, you have children under the age of 2, pretty much everyone believes their child is a genius. You ever notice this? I think he's a genius. I'm not really sure. And then the other thing, before I had a teenager myself, I was always amazed when people who had teenagers, how blunt they were about how their child is. Well, he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, but we really love him. And I was amazed until I had a teenager. And in a sense, Children at Risk is like that very blunt parent. We're here to talk about what does the evidence say around our children in the state of Texas. What's happening and what can we change? And we look at evidence and we look at data. And someone said this to me recently, in God we trust, all others must bring data. And so we look to see what's really happening. And so I'm going to share a little bit about that today. We live in a state with about 5 million school children. What's really interesting about that is that Texas is this economically vibrant, great things happening here. But of those 5 million school children, 60% are low income. The other thing that's really interesting is that when you look at the data, those are the children that are going to have the hardest time succeeding. When you grow up in poverty, you have a very hard time being successful. Some of us grew up in poverty and we were successful, but in some ways when you look at the data, it's a little bit of an anomaly for that to happen. So we have to figure out, what do we do for that 60% of our children, and we're talking probably a little over 1 million children right in the Houston area that are growing up in poverty. So this very wealthy state, we have the 10th highest child poverty rate in the nation. We have a fast-growing population, primarily Latino. Latino families are very young. They're having babies. I have a colleague over at Rice University. I think he's going to be on later, Steve Kleinberg. He often says, old white people will try as hard as we can, but it's hard to increase the population. And that's a little joke. He'll have to tell it. He'll be way funnier. So when we look at this population, we try to figure out, what do we do differently? What is it that we can do to make sure our children are successful? And the evidence is clear. There are ways for this to happen. And we've broken it down to basically 4 key areas when you look at the evidence. The first is, how do we engage parents to be better parents? Because all the time, as I speak around the state, people say, well, what about the parents? What are they doing? And parents want to be engaged, but we have a lot of young parents that really don't know how to be very good parents. Yet parenting is not part of public policy. We're not doing anything to make sure that our parents are better parents. Right now, when a baby is born in a hospital, parents are offered breastfeeding classes and parents are offered birthing classes. No one is offered parenting classes by and large. And when we do surveys, what we find is that first-time parents, especially Latino parents, all say, oh, I do a parenting class, but none are being offered. When we did a huge assessment in Houston about what was happening with parenting, we found very few parenting classes offered unless they were punitive. There was some child abuse, okay, you're sent to parenting classes. Nothing was positive about it. And only 3% of those offered were evidence-based. So we're gonna have to change what's happening around parenting. The second thing that we see is within early childhood and pre-K, we have this huge gap, especially again with this high poverty population, that the working poor in Texas, the working poor in Houston, by and large, are parents that are working a couple of jobs. They're poor and they're working and they don't know what to do with their kids. And our public school system, up to age 4, if you're lucky, will not help you, right? And so what happens now, without any sort of active early education, at this time of life when children are learning the most, when they're the most influenced, when you could really make an impression on them, at that part of life, what are most families in Texas and Houston doing? They're finding the safest lady down the street, pretty much safe, pretty much inexpensive. As long as my child is safe, I'm going to go ahead and warehouse my child there. Now, they don't say warehouse, but that's really what's happening. We're not seeing active early education happening. And you see long lines for some of the early education centers like Small Steps and others that are trying to reach out, but there are not enough of those places. And so we see all this active learning that should be happening, and really kids are just being safe, not much is happening. And in the area of pre-K, across the state of Texas, when we know that high poverty kids should be doing full day pre-K, the state of Texas pays for half a day of pre-K. So what do we see across the state of Texas is that many parents, they can't leave work to pick up their child halfway through the day and then bring them back to someplace else. So they find the safe lady and they stay with her even though the Texas is paying for half a day. One of the things that we need to change based upon evidence is how can Texas, at least for the high poverty group, at least for them, how can we do full day pre-K? Because the evidence is very clear that that will work. Moving into quality K through 12 education, Children at Risk is the group that ranks every single school across the state. So that what we look for are the high performing, high poverty schools. Because you can have a high performing, affluent school, that's pretty easy. We see a lot of those. But we look for those schools that are doing a particularly good job with that group of kids that are in the low income segment. And what we find, we see certain characteristics within those schools. They all have very high expectations. They all have these principles with sort of an iron fist, a strong leader that knows exactly what she wants, and she's gonna make sure it happens. Teachers that can rally around that and will do whatever it takes. And then this is an interesting thing. They've all figured out how to have a longer school day or longer school year. You go to some of these, even in HISD, some of these schools where they have Saturday tutoring, all the kids show up. I was visiting with one principal, J.P. Henderson Elementary over near U of H, and I said, her name is Erlinda Garcia, and I said, Erlinda, you know, there's a lot of mobility amongst Latino families. How do you make sure that those kids stay? And she said, we just tell them we're a magnet school. We're not, but we just tell them we're a special school, and they manage to keep their kids here. When we look at K through 12, keeping those high expectations, longer school days, more time on task, following the data, and then really sort of focusing on making sure that those kids are successful and moving them into the next, into middle school, moving them into high school. And we have a few of those schools around. We just don't have enough. What we find in many of our urban areas, quick thing, all you need to do, visit any high school, look at the size of their freshman class, and then look at the size of their senior class. You see all this, the 1,200 kids entering the class, 200 graduating. Some of it's mobility, but we see there's up to 50% of kids that start at many ninth grade programs that never finish high school. You hear from the state that we have 2% dropout rate, 8% dropout rate. Don't believe it. Just look at the numbers for yourself. A big study was done recently by the Higher Education Coordinating Board, recognizing that for children to be successful, for our kids to be successful, 60% of the jobs in Texas need a certificate, a 2-year degree, or a 4-year degree. One of those three things. All our children need that. So they figured, let's look at 8th grade, let's follow those kids for 10 years and see at the end of 10 years, what is the percentage of success? What they found is that in the state of Texas, only 20% of our children starting in the 8th grade got any one of those degrees. Texas ranks last in the nation in terms of getting one of those degrees. We send fewer kids to college than any other place, but more importantly, fewer kids graduate than any other place. We have here in Texas, and specifically in Houston, the very schools that first-generation college students are sent to are the schools in our nation with the highest dropout rates, the lowest graduation rates. So here we do all this work, pre-K, K through 12, get the kids to college, get the kids to college, get the kids to college, and when we get them to college, they're not graduating. We're not doing anything special in our schools to make sure that those kids graduate. If they go to UT or A&M or Texas Tech, they're sort of welcomed in this on-campus community, higher rate of graduation. Pretty much all the other schools, they're not doing as well. And some of the other schools, they're doing miserably poor. So if we look at those things, parenting, early education, quality K through 12, getting to college, this is how we break that circle of poverty. That's how we do something different with our children to make sure that they're successful. We have to make sure they're not hungry. We need to make sure that they're healthy. But the best way historically in our nation that we've moved children from one economic class into another has been through quality public education. It's up to us as a community to make this all happen. So the question I leave you with today, what are you guys going to do? Thank you very much.